excited to have Candace. Whoa, let me make this work. Candace Kail, who is a web services librarian at Columbia University. She's also a writing consultant at Columbia's Writing Center. She also serves in the Journal of Web Librarianship, reviews books for the Library Journal. She is a web librarian, which is amazing because if we need anything, we need a more organized internet. That's what we're always talking about. Very, very excited to have her here as she talks about information architecture work in the context of web librarianship. You know, it's one of those things. Libraries are still important. Just because they might not have books in them more. You know, the way that books in a library used to talk to each other, hyperlinks might seem to speak to each other as well. You know, thoughts emanating and surviving the death of those who produce them. We're very excited to have Candace. Is she ready?
Yep, she is.
Thank you.
Good morning. Welcome to World IA Day. I'm Candace Kail, as was mentioned, and I'm the Web Services Librarian at Columbia University. We recently redesigned and re-architected our library's website. It was not always a happy process, but it ended up in a really happy place. So that's what we're going to talk about. So we moved from this type of design to, with apologies to Pharrell Williams, the happier web design, though it took us a while to get there. Did you know there's a 24 hours of happy website? It involves dancing and makes bad days pretty much impossible. So effective IA was the foundation of our redesign. Oops, sorry. And we really tried hard to work with our users throughout the layer, to sort through our layers of information, because we found that they helped us see patterns and identify organizing principles that we might never have seen or identified, because our relationship to the site is very different from theirs. So because IA helps structure and organize your site, it really is the foundation of a happy website. The less I have to think about how to use a site, the happier, or at least less likely to gripe, I am with the experience. Our users' time is precious. Letting them flow through our site and find what they need saves the time of the reader. To quote Ranganathan, Ranganathan's laws of library science are from the 1930s, and I have taken the liberty of adapting them to apply to our library site and information use overall. Books are for use, according to Ranganathan, and websites are too. Every reader, his or her book, and every user, his or her information need. Every book its reader, and every website its user. Save the time of the reader, save the time of the user. The library is a growing organism. Well, the web, it's also a growing organism, and we shouldn't be static. So our IA is almost like a blueprint for our site. It shows our users which floors and rooms the content will be in. We began with a site that had been developing for over a decade. It hadn't ever been re-architected, and all of the redesigns prior to this one really just changed the color scheme and background images. The rollover menus couldn't be used on certain touchscreen devices. The site was nowhere near responsive anyway, but we had a solid core of users, librarians, library staff, faculty, and researchers who can navigate the site like native New Yorkers navigate streets full of tourists. If you are a New Yorker trying to get somewhere, you may not be happy about two tourists holding a large map between them blocking the sidewalk on 17th Street as they search for Union Square. The map they are using isn't doing anything to help you get where you need to go. But without it, they'll never get where they are going. This was sort of like the dilemma we faced in redesigning our site. Our newer users, the bulk of our users, younger faculty and researchers, incoming students, were tourists with no map, but our experienced users demanded we maintain our complexities for the natives. So we went to do a bunch of assessments and work to prepare for our redesign. We wanted to prepare for a redesign that would be based on re-architecting the website. No one was yet ready to really reconceptualize our content or to rethink its purpose and goals. So we focused on architecting the site with the content we already had. And by began to prepare, I mean well in advance. The assessment plan that would become the foundation of our process was presented in December of 2008 by myself and our assessment librarian. We actually, our redesigned site went live with a soft launch in June of 2013. In the interim, we did a lot of work. We researched, selected, and migrated our website into a new content management system. This CMS allowed us to even think about doing a redesign. Before we couldn't have possibly done what we did. I did a content inventory that involved all of our divisions looking at their nearly 10,000 pages of content systematically and marking in a spreadsheet whether to delete, keep, and migrate or archive that content. We migrated approximately 4,700 pages by hand into the new system, cleaning up the many inconsistencies we found in our heuristic. Some on our web team, made up at the time of 1.5 developers and myself, and by 1.5 I mean one full-time and one part-time developer, and myself, we were initially disappointed not to redesign when we implemented our new CMS. Doing it the way we did, however, made our redesign a lot stronger, a lot more agile, and a lot easier to sell organizationally. All of this eventually led to our card sort, which I will describe in more detail in a few minutes. That's a picture of the card sort on my desk. Once we migrated to our new CMS and trained our content contributors, we began to prepare those contributors for the idea of a brand new site. We analyzed lots of data and assessments and began introducing the idea of supporting decisions with user testing. We used the assessment culture that had been building to our advantage, and the web was truly transforming at the same time. So we began our process. Our official kickoff meeting was in summer of 2010 with a meeting of the powers that be. We decided not to design by committee, to base the redesign squarely in UX and user-centered design principles, and to completely redo the site's architecture. I developed a set of principles and definitions that we all agreed to. Eventually, we posted these on a redesign blog for our internal users. What we started with. The IA we were working with had been developed by a group that included a couple of the key players on our team, unbeknownst to me until I stuck my foot in my mouth during a meeting. It had served its purpose at the time, but had been thought of more like a file structure and used labeling such as indiv, this to designate individual libraries, hence foot and mouth movement. It had also just been added to somewhat willy-nilly due to the way our site is created and maintained, with 100 contributors each doing things his or her own way. So even if it had once been a solid foundation, it had grown to be wobbly and very cluttered. What we wanted was a clean foundation that provided a set of building blocks that allowed contributors, developers, and users to easily understand the structure of the site and how to move between and within the levels. Or at least a foundation that provided a clear path for users so they could see how to move through the structure of the site and get to the various places they needed to go. Because our ultimate goal was to go from this UX, since we knew we weren't making our users happy, and our site was not user-centered or designed to meet UX goals, to this. We knew we wanted the redesign and our IA as its foundation to make our users happy, to be user-centered, to have a much happier UX. So what does a happy library's website user look like? That depends a little, well, okay, maybe a lot, on who you ask. To me, a happy library website user can quickly scan the site, identify the kinds of information and services available, and find what they need. If what they need is to interact with a person, they can find ways to contact staff quickly and seamlessly. If what they need is to explore some of the intricacies of our 22 locations and their collections, they can get to those descriptions and locations without having to already know the names of the libraries, or worse, the names of the donors who gave specialized and specially named collections in order to get to them. And a happy library website user can find the resources he or she needs be it a book, article, archive, journal, film, piece of music, etc., without having to learn how libraries and librarians think about organizing all of those different things. So our happy website users look like graduate school students, humanities researchers, global studies students, librarians, the reader who wants his book, and those who want their information all online, the music school student who wants to read about a favorite composer, engineers and research scientists who need just the right piece of information for the experiment, the humanities faculty member who is finding amazing lost histories among our rare books and archives, and students who are collaborating on data and GIS projects. And they were really at the heart of our redesign. And those are all actual pictures of our students and faculty members, and librarians too. So which users were we committed to making happy? Well, therein lies the problem. Our site had revolved around our librarians. Indeed, it developed from an intranet site that was created by and made for staff alone. We committed to redesigning and re-architecting for our Columbia University users, undergraduate and graduate students, faculty, and researchers and scholars. We worked to explore and identify their needs and tried to find ways to make the site respond to those needs more effectively. Our prior site was not very intuitive for first-time users, particularly students and younger faculty. For the most part, it was very confusing. We had designed it in line with the larger university site in the early 2000s, and it hadn't changed much since. But between 2000 and 2012, the web had changed tremendously. We didn't want to strive for a world where we needed all our users to be the same for our website to make them happy. Contrary to what one might think about an academic library site, our users were not homogeneous. They range in age from 17 to their 70s and 80s. They approach the web with degrees of sophistication and with various levels of education, from students just out of high school who have learned to astounding effect how to produce what teachers want, to researchers and thinkers who are on the cutting edge of their scholarly conversations. And their needs from our site differ tremendously. Making them all happy would be nearly as impossible as getting all the tourists in New York City to understand and work within New York City's well-structured and highly efficient pedestrian patterns the instant they arrived. We knew an undergraduate student might use our site much differently than a visiting historian using our rare books and archives to support her research. But for our website to support the users it needs to support, it had to make both happy. How have we accomplished this? Not entirely. We were not involved in rethinking the catalog, search, and discovery tools and interface, though we do provide a way into that system from every page of our site. We had to balance a lot of in developing labels and navigation, and we have yet to really explore and rethink our content. But I hope we have gotten off to a fairly strong start, and I'll have a little more about content later. And of course, we also had to please the powers that be, right? We had to consider our organizational needs as well. Many of those people had committed to a user-centered design and an agile one, and they had heard a lot about our assessment findings, and they had frustrations with our site as well. And there were some organizational goals to balance with those findings. So which users were we committed to making happy? Ultimately, we're hoping to make everyone on campus happy. However, we knew that because of a university, education of thought in all its multiplicities is central mission and prioritize users' needs rather than trying to be all things to potential users. We also definitely didn't want to force them all to have to think about our site the same way we do. At the same time, we very much wanted to make the website experience as happy for librarians as possible. We tried hard to involve the librarians in the redesign process without going back to a design by committee, non-user-centered approach. It was a challenge in many ways. First, the librarians' responses to all of the assessments proved them to be outliers when compared to our other user groups. They use the site daily for their work, which is unique work from that of our other user groups, and which makes for a very different relationship to the site and the content. Librarianship as a profession has also been engaged for some years now in a deep philosophical struggle. Librarians want users to be independently able to find and use library resources, but they also want to play a role in the user's processes to find those resources. We weren't going to be able to make all of the library's staff happy no matter what. But we at least wanted to make them understand our decisions and our process. How did we use IA in our redesign process? Well, we began with data, some analytics and usage data, some data from massive assessments called LibQual, which is we do a campus-wide survey about every 3 years about our library's services. And we did a number of other assessments. We had already begun applying the findings from our 2009 heuristic evaluation. The report was 87 pages long, to the site when we moved to the new CMS. So we had a stronger foundation to work from than we might have otherwise. We did a card sort, inviting people from what we had identified as our main user groups, undergraduates, graduate students, and faculty, to participate. We included internal users in the card sort as well. They were all librarians. And we used the findings from the card sort in 2 major ways. One was the traditional outcome of a card sort, grouping our content in ways that were shown to be more meaningful by our users. The other, though, was to illustrate how differently the librarians sorted our content in comparison to our users. And that actually was a really key component of getting the librarians on board with our redesign process. The librarians and staff work with and think about our content completely differently, as I mentioned before. And as we found in analyzing the card sort results. The team that analyzed the results were 6 librarians from across the organization, from rare book and manuscripts to the sciences, from the social sciences and the humanities. So that really helped with breaking the news that librarians organized all of our stuff dramatically differently than our users did. Librarians passed on the bad news that all the outliers in our findings were essentially librarians, not the faculty, as everyone had assumed. After we analyzed assessments and came up with high-level categories from our card sort for the content on the site, we began discussing all of the findings and hammering out the labels and the architecture or structure of our site. We did a lot of education. We educated librarians and ourselves. We used a consultant to work with a group of librarians to talk about IA principles, UX principles, and we also had that same consultant work with the actual team that was doing the redesign to work through the initial steps of the information architecture process and to try to identify where we were all assuming labeling systems that were jargony and not user-friendly. And that helped because it brought in an outside perspective and wasn't just internal. A lot of people still felt that their territory was being invaded or that their baby was being tossed out. And even though we had laid almost 2 years of groundwork to establish our user-centered process and had about 9 years of assessment material, people still took a lot of the change very personally, and sometimes very negatively. We were essentially starting over and rebuilding the site from the foundations up, and a lot of the people on the team had been very involved in building that site to the point that it was when we did our redesign. Most everyone agreed that a redesign was long overdue, but their experience of past redesigns had been the colors and maybe some fonts changed, maybe the overall image associated with the site, but that otherwise there was no significant change. What we did was throw everything up in the air, sort it all out, and then begin building again using what we learned and knew from our users. This was new. This was scary. This was less librarian-oriented and more user-oriented. It was not the way things had always been done. So I did a lot of presentations. I went out and did presentations for various groups across the libraries, describing our approach, explaining our goals, and created a blog about the redesign, posting our principles, publicizing our commitment to user-centered design with a UX approach. I carried a redesign glossary of terms handout with me wherever I went and gave it to completely innocent staff wandering the halls of Butler Library to get them on board with our redesign. We also had a lot of meetings. Things got messy. Some of the developers had an increasingly hard time with the process, the decisions, and the IA. Our team was made up of one designer, two developers, the web services librarian, a division director, two associate university librarians, and occasionally the marketing coordinator. One of the AULs left and was replaced during the redesign process, and 3 marketing coordinators came and went. So that made it a very interesting time. We spent a long time on the IA as a group. Few of those meetings were not very happy. Once we had all the information to create the IA, we had several very heated meetings to settle on the structures and labels. The first set ended in a draw and with a lot of tension. One developer was definitely not very happy. He had a methodical approach to things, had been instrumental in developing the site's previous structure, and also had a kind of unique way of working and navigating other websites. But he had really struggled with why we should approach the site development from our end user's perspective and not from the librarian's perspective. Because in his mind, the librarians were the experts and the librarians were the content contributors, and they knew what he thought they knew what their users needed. And our something else. Our assessments were showing that the librarians might know what a certain set of users needed, the set that came to them and said, I need help doing X, but they didn't know what the greater number of our users needed, right? So we had really to present this information in multiple ways so that the staff would get on board. At Columbia Libraries, we have about 450 people working in the libraries alone, and about 150 of those are librarians. So we have a lot of, and we have a lot of kind of strategic players in the organization that have a big say in what their content is and what's important, and so we had to kind of learn how to balance all of those things. So after many tense discussions, we had a very focused 2-hour meeting with the goal, really, of finishing our IA. We looked at the card sort results. We looked at all of the kinds of jargon that we had identified. We tried to think through a lot of the hard questions about what we wanted to do. And we ended that 2-hour meeting in a draw. It was a very tense time. So we scheduled another meeting. We gave ourselves some distance. The AULs said, next time we'll do it over lunch. We'll bring lunch. We'll just kind of sequester ourselves in a conference room, whiteboards, whatever we need, and kind of hammer it out. We gave ourselves about a week of time and several late night phone conversations to move between the two meetings. And throughout this process, none of us wanted our users to throw up their hands in frustration. We wanted them to be able to easily do their work, and we wanted our site to support them. We never lost sight of our UX goals. Even the developer who was not happy handing over the control to our users instead of the librarians, he knew that we really needed a user-oriented site. And we hadn't lost out all of the findings of our assessments, right? We had done a lot of assessment work with an eye toward developing the structure of the site. We thought it was really, really important to get the IA right. And our assessments essentially said that every time we made an exception, usability decreased. So we built a new IA based on the decisions made at all of those very challenging meetings. And of course, not everything we had fit nicely into the new structure. But we hammered our way through it. And we had a couple more painful meetings along the way, but we definitely came to a different place once we started actually putting the content in front of ourselves and thinking through how we were going to label it and structure it and building it in a different environment. We had started out with OmniGraffle and moved to a kind of web-based program called SlickPlan. And the SlickPlan visuals were so much easier for our team to digest that it made the process a lot more straightforward. So how did IA make things easier? Well, it eventually did make things easier. It just took some time. We got to a much happier place. It made certain things easier even at the card sort stage. For example, the librarians and management understood the results of the card sort in a very different way and understood our site in a very different way as a result of the card sort than they had before. Once our team arrived to the understanding that navigation does not equal IA, things began to get easier. And eventually, as we moved wireframing, prototyping, and templating to developing, programming, and moving the content, our IA did make things a lot easier. And with the librarians that we worked with, we used technologies in our redesign that some of the more savvy and engaged staff were familiar with, such as Twitter Bootstrap, thus making them feel like they were part of our conversations around the redesign. This meant that those staff asked a lot of hard and good questions, but it also worked in our favor as they praised those choices to other staff. And it was a really interesting process. We have changed organizationally throughout that process. We have seen the impact that changes to the library profession have had on librarians and how the maturation of the web continues to change our librarians' relationship to our interface designs and web strategies. We still sort of struggle with the relationship between IA and navigation. Does anyone else have that problem? It's hard for someone who really thinks of systems and websites hierarchically to really wrap her head around the idea that navigation through the structure might not include every node within it, even though she logically understands that our top-level navigation can't possibly include all 4,700 of our pages. But once the idea that the IA contained the navigation but didn't equal the navigation got through, it helped. Our IA also made things easier through our usability testing. We used Silverback to do a usability study and taught the library staff and even our unhappy developer a lot about how people experienced the new site. Our users found it pretty easy to navigate. We established a suggestions and feedback form that allowed staff and others to vent about the changes being made. Many people said nice things too. We tried to explain our decision-making process, and we thoroughly involved librarians in analyzing our key assessments related to the IA and navigation, particularly the card sort. And where our IA shone was when we had to port the content into our new structure and apply our new templates and layouts. We had a lot of content. It was haphazardly structured. I created a content map in Excel that told our developers where each set of content needed to go in the new IA. Because our new structure was so much more streamlined and so much clearer, they could easily program our systems to route the content to the right place, apply the appropriate template for that content type, and ensure that pages and information did not get lost along the way. Our maps were working on the back end for developers, and all that difficult work of deciding what our IA should be really paid off for the programmers and developers. And we were making sure our natives and tourists could find their way too. With my many preview site presentations who had a lot of who moved my cheese questions, with our usability studies and other feedback options, and with our marketing campaign. We reached out personally to user groups, including well-established faculty, who we thought might have difficulty with. Our launch coincided with the complete overhaul of our search and discovery system, so that took some of the heat off the new site. People had far more questions and difficulties with the new search than with the new website. And how are we using IA going forward? We want to keep allowing our site to evolve, and we're very committed to an agile and iterative site philosophy. So as we change our content, add new services, and offer new things, we continue to use our IA framework to support that content. We make decisions deliberately so that the structure continues to support our needs. We have created our IA in such a way that it can be built up or built out. However, we haven't needed to build it out. And when we add to it, so far, our structure is held and allowed us to do what we need to do with the site. We still have work to do to apply our IA to certain areas of our content management system that we either didn't or couldn't do in the initial phase of our redesign, particularly the digital assets. But mostly, we are using our IA to help us move through the coming phases of the iterative process. Next up is content. Our site, so I have a little quote from Jesse James Garrett, who describes what an information architect does as someone who creates structures to facilitate effective communication. And as a writer, I love that. And as a writer, I'm also really dedicated to the content of our site. Our site navigation, structure, and design have worked out really well for our users. But as pretty and happy as we've made our IA, our designs, and our navigation, those things won't keep our users coming back. They can get our users to the places they need to be, but only the content can give them the information they need. Our content should be geared toward meeting our users' needs and getting them to return for more. And that's what we've begun to focus on in this phase of our iterative design process. Content is really the center of our user experience. The navigation and structure are there to support the content, get users to the content easily without them having to think, and to keep them happy using the site. But ultimately, the content is what they really need. And by focusing on content as user experience, we hope to keep making our users even happier. And that's actually a class at Columbia with a professor dancing down the aisle. And I believe the president is there in the front row of the university. So with apologies to Pharrell Williams, that is my presentation. And I think we have several minutes for questions, if anybody has questions.
Hi.
Hi.
Great presentation. I wanted to ask you, I'm somewhat familiar with Columbia's libraries and Columbia as an institution. And like most major institutions or libraries, things are very siloed. And the experience I have with the Columbia libraries is very individual to each library. I basically have to go out and find or identify that they even have the library I want, and then I can actually get to information. So I was wondering if you could talk to how this redesign or this future vision was planning to hopefully affect, how do I say this? To hopefully make it so even just finding the right website to begin with, which has been difficult for me to do on Columbia's website for other reasons, that it's great when someone already goes there. Let's say they go to the library and talk with you and you're right next to them when they're doing it. But how do you maybe open up and make the library information more accessible to students or even, people abroad who might be interested in Columbia and actually get to that information?
So that's something that we have definitely struggled with. And if I'm understanding your question, are you, do you mean when you search for materials, you have trouble identifying which library it is, or that each library has its own kind of look and feel and set of services? Okay. So we have an assessment librarian as well. And we've been doing assessments both on the website, and we're continuing to do usability studies for the website, as well as doing assessments of the physical spaces and our services. And one of the things that we've been trying to move from doing just kind of usability studies that are task-based to focus group-centered usability talks and thinking through with our user groups how to make this experience of the physical spaces seamless. So we've done some physical space assessments. We've also done, we've started working with the Provost Office to develop a faculty advisory committee and a student library advisory committee. So those just formed last semester. And we've started to work with them to identify some of the issues that people come up against, where people are stumbling, whether it be in our physical spaces or on our website, and to continue to develop those. One of the things that we wanted to do with our IA was to really make our site such that we could make changes to it based on these assessments and based on changing user needs without having to restructure or completely redesign the site every 5 years. So does that help answer your question? Other questions? Yeah.
Can you say more about what you found to be effective in getting all these internal players, the librarians, the developers, to shift from this mentality of we need to get the students speaking our language, we need to get them using our mental models, to
We need to use their mental models.
Yeah.
So the card sort did really provide a foundation for that. Our assessments over and over showed that we were speaking two different languages. The card sort started to bridge that gap because we had the librarians do the analysis of the card sort. We didn't have the developers and designer do the analysis of the card sort. We really had the librarians. Myself and the assessment librarian kind of oversaw the process, but we let the librarians come to the understanding themselves that this categorization exercise and the labeling and things that that we had asked our card sort participants to do were definitely showing that the librarians had a very different way of doing it. So that was one big step in the process. But of course, you can say that and you can show them that, but that doesn't like change the actual behavior and feeling of the staff and the librarians. But I think that through the whole assessment process and the kind of culture of assessment that we've tried to develop, so we've worked over the past, I'd say, maybe 9 years now, to try to develop this kind of culture where assessment-based change is what we do, rather than just making changes based on what we think is a good way of doing things or what we think our users' needs are. And I think in librarianship for a long time, and I think in libraries that can be kind of very hierarchical and broad in terms of their systems, that has tended to be some of the process, is making these kind of hierarchical top-down decisions. And we tried really hard to develop a culture of assessment. So we had an assessment working group that was comprised of librarians from all over the organization, as well as staff members, public services staff from different parts of the organization, and even technical services librarians, so that everybody kind of understood what our findings were and what people were saying to us as we did those assessments. When we did the usability studies, there are some privacy issues, right? So we can't show the video of the usability study to our internal people, but we can do presentations and say, we can play a little clip of the audio or show where the mouse is moving, even if we're not showing the user's face, to maintain the privacy of that. And that, that visual is really helpful. And getting the Student Library Advisory Committee together, I think, is going to continue that work. And just the new librarians coming in and the new ideas that they bring with them also kind of helps shift that. Yeah.
All right, thank you.
You can ask after.